You know what's crazy? Here's a timeline of world history, and humans have done writing this whole time, but it changed so much. During the first 2,000 years in the Bronze Age, we wrote on tablets. And in the modern period, we got the printing press and the internet. But what happened in the middle? We know there was something in between tablets and books. But what was it? There's so many juicy questions here. How did we get the alphabet? How did the Roman Empire have an empire without paper? And what was all this writing used for all these empires and religions? So today we're going to solve the puzzle for this missing chapter of writing. And there are four main parts to this puzzle. First, we're going to look at the rise of alphabets, which is crazy. And then second, we're going to look at all these things we used to write on before printing. And then third, we're going to look at how empires and religions used this explosion of writing to kind of take over the world. And then fourth, we're going to look at a very special case here, the Incan Empire, and how they didn't have writing, but they still were able to govern. And if you're new here, hi, I'm Reese, and welcome to How Everything Evolved, where we do research deep dives to help answer history's juiciest questions, and not just AI slop. Let's do it. Okay, first, how do we go from just pictures to alphabets? So here's an image that shows the kinds of ways we used to write. And this is kind of early cuneiform writing, and these are essentially pictographs, where it's like, oh, here's what water looks like. Nice. Here's what corn looks like. You know, here's what a wedge looks like. But the issue with systems like this is that you have to learn so many different symbols as a kid. You know, instead of learning 26 letters in the English alphabet, you have to learn like 500. And this still kind of continued even though cuneiform became a little bit easier to learn. It became logo-symbolic, I think is what it's called, where they started to have syllables to denote things, but it still wasn't a full kind of consonant and alphabet writing system. And the crazy thing is we wrote like that for 2.5 thousand years, from like 3,000 to 500. But then around the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, the Phoenicians and then eventually the Greeks start to write with these cool alphabets. They started with these syllabaries, kind of like the ones I just showed you, both in Egyptian hieroglyphics and in cuneiform, where you can start to say words from other languages in your syllabary. And then they made these abjads, which are just consonants, and that worked for some of these specific like Semitic languages. And then eventually we got something like Greek. So here's a bowl with the Greek alphabet, which was the first alphabet with consonants and vowels in the world. And you can see these letters that we kind of know today, like A and B and D and E. It's amazing. And mostly what this does is it makes it easier for everybody to read and write. You can then only have to learn 26 letters or 24 letters, and then you can start to do all the things that we know today, where you can combine them more easily. You can take anything that's in the vocal space and turn it into the written space or vice versa. And so here's a thing that shows the family tree of some of these writing systems, from the hieroglyphs to the Sinaitic things to the Phoenician, and then that turns into Greek and stuff like Latin for, you know, us Americans, what we speak these days. And then Phoenician also turns into Aramaic, which turns into, you know, what the Hebrews were speaking and the Jews were speaking. And then eventually you get like Arabic, plus you get Brahmani, and you get all the like Hindu and Indian subcontinent languages. And here's another way to visualize that, but as a map in, 250 BCE, around the time of Alexander. And yeah, you can see Greek is spreading and Aramaic is spreading. And these are languages that have alphabets. But now we can look at the second big upgrade to writing, which is moving away from heavy, annoying tablets and towards these kind of light writing surfaces. So remember, this is what we used to be dealing with, was all these big old tablets, it's just like annoying to deal with. And so as we switched away from tablets, what did we switch to? It wasn't immediately directly to paper. So what did we do in the middle? And so this chart kind of shows what we wrote on over time from 1500 BCE to 1500 CE. And you can see here that tablets was all over here was all tablets, before this, during the Bronze Age. So as we switched away from tablets, there were two massive things we switched to. One of them is, we switched to papyrus, and that's in Egypt, and, writing on papyrus. But that switched to parchment, which was essentially writing on animal skins. But the other thing we switched to, mostly in the East and like China, was we switched to these palm leaf things, but especially these bamboo and wood slips. And then eventually around, year zero is when China started to create paper. It spread in China, it spread to the Middle East, and then it took over the world. So here's an awesome picture of some of the parchment that we used to write on, which was just, you take an animal skin, you remove the fur or whatever, and then you write on it. And here are these awesome bamboo wooden slips, which, in China, you're writing on bamboo. And this is kind of proto-paper, because instead of writing on animals, you're writing on plants and bark. I like to think of this as happening around the same time of textiles, where we were, instead of just wearing animal skins and wearing grass, we were starting to turn grass and cotton and linen into clothes, and we were starting to turn animal skin and wool. We were starting to say, hey, let's make some wool and weave that into fibers for clothes. And so textiles are things where we put light, soft things on ourselves, like all of this stuff, like clothes and cloth or whatever. And at the same time as we're making this new light and soft thing, we are also making these new forms of proto-paper, which are, you want a light thing to carry around that can hold not just dye, but also, dye in the ink form. And we got better and better at making textiles over time, and better at making paper over time. But they're both fundamentally kind of the same process. Once you change the medium of the writing surface, it also changes how you kind of package it together. So here's the thing that shows that. This is showing the amount of like tablet production over time. And this is during the Bronze Age. And so what you can see here is we are starting to produce more and more tablets, from 1,000 to 10,000 books worth of tablets every 250 years or so. And then when we switch to papyrus and we switch to parchment, when we switch to some of those bamboo wood slips that kind of get turned into these little like pseudo kind of scroll-like things, that then is the rise of scrolls. So this shows from 1500 to 0 BC, we're saying, okay, tablets, you thought that was a big deal. We were making 1,000 books worth of tablets, back in the day. That's nothing compared to what happened with scrolls. We started to produce 100,000, almost 1 million books worth of scrolls over time. And then finally, that turned into these codices, which are essentially like a little book, a little proto book. And this is from 0 to 1500 CE. You can see, we were producing some scrolls, but then as paper spread, we started to really produce tons and tons, hundreds of millions, tens of millions of books worth of codices over time. And a codex is essentially what we think of as a book now, where you have a spine, and that spine contains all these little pages together. And so instead of having a long, annoying scroll, you have like a thing that you've bound together. You can track the rise of tablets, then scrolls, then books and codices through libraries. And so here's the biggest libraries over time. And so this all starts with the Library of Ashurbanipal around 600 BCE, Neo-Assyrian Empire. That library is amazing. It looks something like this. I saw this in the British Museum recently, and they have these 20,000 tablets, which is so cool. But those tablets, if you add up all the text on them, it's only like 100 books worth of tablets. And then about 800 years later, the Library of Alexandria, also where I've been, they had 100,000 scrolls. And so it looks more like this, where you have all these scrolls, all this papyrus, and that's a ton more scrolls. And it's a lot more than Ashurbanipal. It's about 6,000 books worth. So you go up around 60x. But then finally, of course, you get books. The Baghdad House of Wisdom around 900 CE is a great example of this. They have about 1 million books in there probably, which is something like 400,000 modern book equivalents. So again, it's another increase of another like 60x. So you're kind of 60xing every 500 or so years the amount of content in these massive libraries. But the Baghdad House of Wisdom wasn't actually the biggest medieval library. There's a not well-known library in Cordoba, and this is when the Islamic Caliphates controlled all of Spanish Iberia, all of North Africa, Egypt, all of the Middle East, Turkey, into, Iran, all the way to the east often, sometimes into India. And so in Cordoba, they have this library there that is massive. I think it's like 2 to 5 times bigger than the Baghdad House of Wisdom. And it's a crazy thing about Cordoba. They have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of books, and just the amount of books for the index of the library was like almost 100 volumes long. And for comparison, one of the best libraries in Europe, called the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, they had about 100 volumes total. So literally the index for this Cordoba library was as big as the best European library at the time. And so we know that during this time period, the writing substrate has totally changed. We have better alphabets and we have better kind of writing surfaces to write on. But then that gets to number 3, which is, what the heck did we use it for? Writing, especially back then, still takes so much effort. So why did we do it? And how did it change us as people? Well, one of the first things that happened is we started to read and write more. So the global literacy rate went from roughly 0% up to almost like 5% by the end of this period. And that obviously pales in comparison to our modern literacy rate. This is from 1800 through now, which went from 10% to 90%. And so this is just part of the theme of, first we make our tools and then our tools change us. So that's kind of like how people made crops and then crops made us farmers. We start to create writing, and then writing, by existing in our ecosystem, makes us readers and it makes us literate. In order to do that, you have this amazing new division of labor where you have a whole set of people, the nerds, who are scribes. But of course, one of the main things that writing does for us is it helps groups and empires and religions stick around. And so here's a great example of this. It's called the Domesday Book, which is a great survey of England by William the Conqueror. And so he came into England, 1088 or whatever, and he said, look, we're gonna get some people to kind of go on horses or walk around and take note of like what all exists so I can tax it. And so here's an example. I mean, we're so used to these maps today, but back then, this was kind of special to say, hey, here's Leicestershire, and here's Buckinghamshire, and here's Ufordshire, or whatever. I'm from Scotland, so I can be racist. So this is 1086. And yeah, you can see in these books, they made this little Domesday Book. They did all these circuits where they went around, they said, what's going on here? How many livestock do you have? And a survey of this scale wasn't done in England for like 700 years. Fundamentally, writing is an externalized and crystallized memory. It's like taking our brain and putting it outside of our body. It creates these crystallized layers of truth, or at least these blurry JPEGs that exist in the environment long after we're dead. And states, these leviathans, they use them as their way to see the world and to continue perpetuating their power. So they're kind of eyes for the state, or kind of cameras for the state. And by taking all these little pictures, states and groups and religions are able to continue pushing their agenda, good or bad. I love this example that shows how writing was able to let states perpetuate. And this is Venice, in the medieval ages and in the Renaissance. And this is a project that some researchers are doing. And what they've done is they've compiled, there's, tens of thousands of volumes of just like admin papers, just like, binders of crap from the last like 1,000 or so years. And what they've done is they've then used that to reconstruct this digital Venice. This is called a Venice time machine. And what they're able to do is then go back to year 1000 or year 1500 or wherever, and they have all the documents of the bureaucracy at that time. And so they know kind of what Venice looked like. And this project is awesome because it then spread to countries and cities all around the world. Now there are hundreds of these time machines that exist for all these cities around the world because we have the writing, because we have the cameras, because we have the snapshots and the externalized and crystallized memory that shows what things were like hundreds of years ago. And of course, the other thing that all of this writing enabled was the spread of religion. And people talk about the codex, these first codices in Europe, as spreading convergently with Christianity. When you look at the best-selling books in history, the Bible, 5 billion, the Quran, 3.5 billion, the little red book from our boy Mao, 1 billion, Harry Potter, 600 million, the Bhagavad Gita from, the Hindu folks, one of the Upanishads, 500 million, the Book of Mormon here. And so, yeah, all these blue ones are religious, and these things are, were produced at the time, and they were able to spread this new ideology. Religions are these crystallized norms and these crystallized stories that persist long after us. They help people coordinate and motivate. And so that's why by the end of this period, the world was covered by these big four religions. It was covered by Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. And that was because you had this propagation of these ideas through books. But that gets this cool question, which is, were there any empires or modern religions that existed without books? And so that leads to the Incan Empire, which is a really cool kind of counterexample. So the Incan Empire in, the Andes of South America, and they existed around, 1430 to 1530. They were around for a century before the Spanish arrived. And it was a big empire, millions of people. And the crazy thing, though, is that they didn't really have writing, or it was a different kind of writing than we're used to. And so they had these teopu, which are these really cool kind of strings of knots. And so we still don't really know how to read them. We're still trying to translate them, because a lot of them were burned by the Spanish, and then a lot of them are lost to time because they don't preserve as well as something like a tablet, especially a tablet that's burned or whatever. And so we still don't totally know, but what we do know already is around 2/3 of the teopu that we found are probably numerical, which makes sense given how important accounting and numerical things are in these other empires. It's like, yeah, you have to know who owns what and who does what. And so the way that these teopu work is that they have ones place, tens place, hundreds place, thousands place, 10,000s place, and the amount of knots on them correspond to essentially the amount in that thing. So you could have a 111, you know, one here, and maybe this is a 3 here, so that's 113. And just like Eurasia has scribes that do writing and reading, so did the Incan Empire have these like Chiopu writers and readers, this kind of specialized class that could read these super complicated and interesting pieces of knots. And what this did, of course, is it helped the empire take snapshots and pictures of reality and kind of track things. The other interesting part about the Incan Empire is that they didn't tax with coins or whatever, they taxed in kind. So you just go and do labor, you know, for like a month a year or whatever. And then also their religion was kind of interesting because, you know, if you can't perpetuate, if you can't like push the Bible or the Quran onto people, what you can do, or the Bhagavad Gita or whatever, instead what they would do is they would be, you know, in these little villages, and they would have in Cusco or whatever, the capital, that's where like the more intense kind of sacrificial religion was. But then that religion, they just said, hey, whatever you guys are doing in your local place, we kind of accept that. And that thing is just going to be like a little demigod or a little mini god within this bigger pantheon that we're making in the capital. But you can see without the ability to kind of push writing onto the rural populace, they weren't able to do what empires in Eurasia could do. So that's what happened in this kind of dark matter period of the history of writing. We didn't just go direct from tablets to the printing press. We had all these cool things in between, from alphabets to the change of the medium that we used, then how empires and religions use them to kind of take snapshots of reality, and then this cool counterexample of the Incan Empire. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And if you're curious about the tablet part of that story, check out this video here, which explains kind of tablets and writing. Or if you want to learn about this other kind of crystallized language thing that we start to do, which is money, subscribe here because that's the next video. Thanks and bye.